Every morning, without fail, I'd step outside with my coffee, only to find my mailbox flattened like a pancake, twisted metal and splinters scattered across the gravel like it had just survived a tornado made of stupid. It was always the same scene: mail crumpled, tire tracks cutting across my ditch, and a familiar muddy tread leading back toward Rick's oversized truck, which he parked proudly 2 doors down like it was some war trophy. I didn't even need to ask. He'd just wave at me with the same smug grin, sipping from a gas station coffee cup as if it were champagne, and drive off like the king of the cul-de-sac. But this last time, I found something new: a crushed Red Bull can shoved inside the shattered remains of the mailbox, with a sticky note stuck to it that read, "Try again, loser." Smiley face, and that was the moment I knew. This wasn't just petty vandalism anymore. This was war. Now, you've got to understand something about Rick. He's one of those guys who never grew past high school glory days. Lifted pickup with exhaust louder than a jet engine, wraparound sunglasses even at night, and the personality of a drunk raccoon. He was the kind of neighbor you hoped would move out every year but somehow kept winning HOA board elections because he brought cheap beer to the meetings. The rest of us tolerated him because we assumed he'd eventually get bored of his own ego and burn out. But lately, he'd turned his attention to me like I was the final boss in whatever game he thought he was playing. It started small, just a dinged-up mailbox one morning. No big deal. I replaced it, thinking maybe a kid misjudged the curb. 2 days later, same story, only this time it looked like someone took a sledgehammer to it. Then I caught a glimpse on my neighbor's Ring doorbell cam. Rick, veering into the ditch with a smile on his face, barely tapping the brakes as he casually obliterated my box with the corner of his massive grill. The worst part? He had music blasting and was singing along when he did it, like it was part of his morning routine. Smash mailbox. Get coffee. Flip off the sunrise. I tried the mature thing. Reported it to the HOA first. They told me it was a neighborly dispute, and suggested I communicate directly. Communicate directly? With a guy who once threatened to sue someone for trimming a tree branch that shaded his lawn? Fine. Next stop, police. Filed a report. The officer barely glanced at the photo evidence before saying, "Well, it's just a mailbox." I asked if I could defend my property. He shrugged and said, "Just make sure it's legal." Legal. That was all I needed to hear. By mailbox number 4, I stopped getting angry. I just stared at the splinters and bent post like a detective at a crime scene, sipping my coffee like it was a dark roast revelation. That was when I found the Red Bull can, bent, wedged into the wreckage, with that smug, sticky note. It was taunting me. I could practically hear Rick's voice in it. Lazy, cocky, like I was just background noise in his sitcom of a life. And that's when something in me clicked. This wasn't just about mail anymore. This was about pride. About principle. About not letting the loudest idiot in the room set the rules. I went back inside, took out an old legal pad, and started sketching. My garage became a war room. The next few days were filled with measuring tape, power tools, and deep dives into federal postal regulations. I learned everything there was to know about mailbox construction, from rural durability standards to concrete anchoring technique. I pulled out some blueprints I hadn't looked at in years, remnants of my time in the military working on reinforced barricade. You see, I wasn't just a retiree with a grudge. I was a retired combat engineer with time, resources, and a deeply personal motivation. But that comes later. For now, back to the neighborhood, where things were quickly escalating. Rick wasn't content with just smashing things. He started bragging about it. At the HOA meeting that month, he made a toast. Literally a toast, with a plastic champagne glass and everything. To mailbox quality control, he said with a smirk. People chuckled awkwardly, not knowing whether to laugh or crawl under their chairs. I just sat there, sipping lukewarm lemonade, counting the days until my masterpiece was ready. A few of the neighbors started noticing the pattern. "Hey, didn't you just fix that thing last week? That's the third one, right?" I smiled, nodded, said, Yeah, but not for long. They assumed I meant I was giving up. Poor souls. They didn't know I was about to turn my front yard into a crime deterrent. That night, I stood out there, in the glow of a flickering porch light, looking at the destroyed husk of yet another mailbox. Wind rustled through the trees. A coyote yipped somewhere in the distance. I sipped my coffee and whispered to myself, let's see how he handles this one. Because the next box wasn't going to be made of wood. It wasn't going to be hollow. And it sure as hell wasn't going to break. This time, the mailbox was going to hit back. My garage hadn't seen this much action since I'd built a deck for my daughter's wedding reception, but now it was ground zero for something far more satisfying. Operation Mailbox Justice. I cleared out the junk, laid down blue tarps, and brought in every tool I owned. The scent of sawdust, steel, and spite filled the air like a glorious war cry. On the workbench, I had plans sketched with military precision. I wasn't building a mailbox anymore. I was building a monument to every fed-up neighbor who had ever watched a bully get away with it. A symbol of quiet, calculated revenge. This wasn't going to be some simple metal post in a concrete bucket. No, this was going to be a fortress disguised as a mailbox. And I was going to make sure it could stop a damn tank if it had to. The first step was selecting the core. I found an old oak log from a buddy's lumberyard, a beast of a thing, almost a foot in diameter and cured so long it felt like iron to the touch. I hollowed it out just enough to run a steel rod through the center, then welded rebar to it for extra resistance. The inside was filled with concrete laced with shredded steel fibers, the same kind used in highway barriers. It weighed close to 200 pounds when I was done with it, and just lifting it onto the work table nearly threw out my back. Worth it. To the outside world, it would look rustic and charming, classic wood grain, stained dark, with an old-school red flag that actually worked. But beneath that cozy exterior, it would be an immovable object. The post was set into a base of reinforced concrete sunk 3 feet into the ground. I even called in a favor from a friend who used to work demolition to test the structural integrity. He came by, tapped it a few times, then just looked at me and said, "You trying to stop cars or launch missiles?" I grinned and said, "Maybe both." Installation took an entire afternoon. I worked in silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic clang of tools, the slow churn of cement mixing, and the occasional bird chirping like it had front-row seats to something legendary. I wore gloves, boots, and a look of absolute focus. I wanted it perfect, straight, level, indestructible. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across my freshly dug trench, I stood back and admired the finished product. It looked like any other mailbox to the untrained eye. But I knew better. And soon Rick would too. Of course, I didn't just stop at the mailbox. That would have been too easy. I set up a trail camera inside a hollowed-out birdhouse on the tree across the road, angled perfectly toward the driveway. Motion-activated, night vision-enabled, time-stamped footage, just in case the law ever needed a play-by-play. I also recorded a short clip explaining the construction and safety compliance in case anyone accused me of malicious intent. It wasn't malicious. It was educational. And honestly, a public service. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days, maybe 3 at most. Rick couldn't resist. He was like a crow drawn to shiny objects, and this mailbox gleamed with fresh polish and defiance. I saw his truck cruising by more than once, slowing down as he scoped it out. I was out front raking leaves when he rolled past with his window down, sunglasses on even though it was cloudy. He gave me a mock salute and chuckled. I just nodded. Let him think whatever he wanted. His time was almost up. That night, I left the porch light off, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat by the window in the dark. It was nearly midnight when I heard it, the familiar rumble of Rick's engine creeping up the street. My heart didn't race. I didn't flinch. I just sipped my coffee and waited. The trail cam would do its job. He slowed as he approached my house. Then came the rev. The tires squealed as he punched it forward. And then, the most satisfying sound I've ever heard in my life. A deafening thunk, followed by a horrible metallic screech, and finally, the soft pop of an airbag deploying. I chuckled quietly. I couldn't help it. It was like watching the finale of the world's dumbest action movie, live from my living room. I peeked through the curtains. Rick's truck was angled sideways in the ditch, steam hissing from the hood. He was stumbling out, dazed, yelling into the night. His bumper was mangled. The front grille was crumpled in on itself. The mailbox? Still standing. Not even a wobble. It looked like it had just gotten a light breeze, not a full frontal assault from a 2-ton ego on wheels. The best part? He looked around like he expected someone to come help him. But the street was quiet. His headlights cast long shadows against the trees. No one came. He kicked at the ground, swore loudly, and eventually got back in his truck. It started after a few attempts, groaning like a wounded animal, and he limped it back to his driveway with half his front fender dragging along the pavement. I watched the whole thing with a calm so pure it felt like meditation. The next morning, I stood on the porch with my usual coffee, same as always. The air was crisp. Birds chirped. The sun peeked over the rooftops. And right in front of me stood the mailbox, pristine as ever. A couple of neighbors walked by with their dogs, nodding in approval as they passed. One of them whispered, "Heard something crazy last night." Was that him? I smiled and said, "No idea. But this new mailbox? Built to last." Rick didn't say a word that day. Not to me, not to anyone. He kept to himself, probably nursing bruises on both his body and his pride. But the message was clear. He'd hit the wall, literally and figuratively. And I was just getting started. For a few glorious days it was quiet, peaceful, even. The kind of calm that makes you second-guess whether things had really been as bad as you remembered. Birds chirped a little louder, coffee tasted richer, and the sound of Rick's gutted truck struggling to start in the mornings was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. I thought maybe, just maybe, the message had landed, that he'd accept defeat and move on like a normal human being. But I should have known better. Rick wasn't wired for humility. If anything, getting humiliated by my mailbox only turned up the heat inside whatever petty, vengeful engine drove him. And it didn't take long before the real storm rolled in. The first warning sign came in the form of a letter. Not from Rick, but from the HOA. A nice, glossy envelope with our neighborhood logo printed in gold foil, like it was an invitation to a country club gala instead of what it actually was, a complaint notice. Inside was a formal warning stating that my mailbox violated several aesthetic standards of the neighborhood, that it did not conform with the approved design language of the community, and posed a potential hazard to vehicles and pedestrians. I laughed out loud when I read it. The thing had literally saved my property from getting totaled. If anything, it was a public safety feature. But no, the HOA had spoken. Now, I've lived here for almost a decade, paid dues on time, attended the meetings, helped shovel snow for elderly neighbors in the winter. And not once had I ever gotten a complaint. But the second I stood up to Rick and his demolition derby antics, suddenly I was the problem? I read through the fine print and noticed something even more suspicious. This complaint wasn't signed by the HOA president or any board members. It was filed anonymously. I didn't need a forensic team to figure out who had written it. So, I did what any rational person would do. I went to the next HOA meeting. I didn't go in guns blazing. I sat quietly in the back while they discussed fence heights and trash bin placement. Then, when it was time for public comments, I stood up and calmly asked who had filed the complaint about my mailbox. The room got real quiet. People shifted in their seat. A couple of folks glanced sideways at Rick, who was sitting 2 rows up looking like a cartoon villain in his oversized hoodie and dark glasses. I asked again, reading the notice word for word. Finally, the HOA president cleared his throat and said, "We received concerns from a member of the community, who felt the mailbox was too aggressive." Too aggressive. That was the phrase he used. as if I'd mounted a rocket launcher instead of building a mailbox that could survive a careless neighbor. I looked at Rick. He smiled. I smiled back. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about him anymore. He had pulled the HOA into his little war. Which meant the fight was officially bigger than one busted truck. I appealed the warning, of course. Sent them documentation of how my mailbox was compliant with both postal regulations and local zoning rules. Included photos, schematics, even a letter from a retired structural engineer buddy of mine who called it a marvel of suburban defensive architecture. Didn't matter. They upheld the warning and tacked on a threat: remove the mailbox within 2 weeks or face $100 a day in fines. It wasn't just annoying now. It was personal. They wanted me to back down, take it all apart, and pretend none of it had happened. But I had other plans. While all this was unfolding, something strange started happening. Neighbors began coming up to me in private. At the grocery store. At the park. Even one guy during a morning jog. They'd say things like, "That thing you built? Genius." Or, "Don't let them get to you. We're with you." Apparently, Rick had made more enemies than friends over the years. People were just too polite or too scared to push back. Until now. A few even started sharing their own stories. Slashed tires. Intimidation. Loud music at all hours. And one neighbor whispered that Rick had once run over her Halloween decorations on purpose and then denied it, saying her inflatable ghost startled him. The more stories I heard, the more convinced I became that this guy wasn't just a nuisance. He was a threat that had somehow flown under the radar for years. The HOA's protection of him didn't feel like ignorance anymore. It felt like fear. Or worse, complicity. Things escalated fast. One morning, I walked outside to find my truck's tires flattened. All four. Not slashed, just deflated with the valve cores neatly removed. Another morning, someone had poured what smelled suspiciously like sugar into my gas tank. I caught that one before starting the engine, thank God, but I knew who had done it. I just couldn't prove it. Not yet. I checked the trail cam footage, but whoever did it had stayed out of frame, likely learning from the last incident. This wasn't vandalism for fun anymore. This was retaliation. But Rick made a mistake. He got cocky. Started telling people he was handling the mailbox guy, that you can't just put up a fortress and expect to win. His words, not mine. He didn't know that one of the people he was bragging to happened to be my neighbor's son, a college student home for spring break, who had grown up watching me teach his dad how to use power tools. That kid recorded the conversation on his phone and sent it to me with a single line. "Thought you might want this." It was the kind of recording you dream of getting when you're stuck dealing with someone like Rick. He admitted to the mailbox hit. Bragged about filing fake HOA complaints under the table. Even mentioned trying to find ways to make Bob's life a little harder with his truck buddies. He thought it was funny. Said it with that same smug tone I'd come to associate with broken mailboxes and smashed bumpers. I took that recording straight to the HOA board. Played it for them in a private meeting. Watched their faces drop one by one. The HOA president looked like he was going to be sick. Turns out, they had no idea Rick was weaponizing the rules like that. Or if they did, they hadn't expected anyone to call their bluff. Suddenly, the tide turned. The complaint against my mailbox was dropped. The fines were canceled. And Rick was issued a cease and desist for harassment. But that wasn't the end. Because as satisfying as that small victory was, I had just started pulling at the first thread in a much larger, darker tapestry. And what I found next would blow this whole thing wide open. You said. When the cease and desist letter landed on Rick's doorstep, hand-delivered by a local sheriff's deputy with a raised eyebrow and a smirk, I thought we'd finally reached the end. That maybe he'd slink back into the shadows, lick his wounds, and realize that there were better ways to spend his time than tormenting someone who built defensive infrastructure for fun. But Rick wasn't just a sore loser. He was the kind of man who believed the rules didn't apply to him because no one had ever held him accountable. Until now. A few days after the letter, I noticed something strange. A black SUV parked across the street, engine idling for hours, someone inside snapping photos with a telephoto lens. At first, I thought it was someone surveying property or maybe an unmarked police vehicle keeping an eye on Rick. But then I saw the same SUV again the next day, and again the next, always in different spots, down the block, around the corner, behind the church at the end of the street. The guy inside wore the same thing every time: baseball cap, hoodie, sunglasses. My gut told me this had nothing to do with me and everything to do with Rick. So I did what any nosy old vet with a grudge would do. I started digging. I called up a friend of mine, Sam, who worked as a clerk in the county records office. We'd served together years ago, and while we hadn't spoken in a while, all it took was a quick coffee and a few donuts for him to pull up everything he could find on Richard Allen Whitman, Rick's full name. Turns out Rick had been involved in a string of accidents and small claims court cases going back nearly 15 years. Property damage, public nuisance, road rage incidents, even an old sealed arrest for harassment that was dismissed before it could go to trial. Most of the charges were dropped. Most of the reports had no follow-up. But they all had one thing in common: Rick walked away untouched. That didn't sit right with me. Not when I'd seen firsthand how easily he flipped the script to make himself look like the victim. I knew there had to be more, something buried deeper. I reached out to another friend, Paula, who worked in state-level law enforcement. I sent her the information, the recording, and explained everything that had happened with the mailbox, the HOA, the retaliation. She didn't promise anything, but she said, "Leave it with me. If there's something buried, I'll find it." 3 days later, she called me back. Her voice was different, quieter, more serious. She said Rick was already on a federal watch list. Apparently, he'd been under informal observation due to suspected involvement in local surveillance crimes. Drones flying illegally over private property, collecting footage, even blackmail cases involving personal videos leaked online. They hadn't tied it directly to him yet, but he was on their radar. The reason they hadn't moved was because they needed solid evidence. Something current. Something damning. That was when Paula asked me a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you want to help?" Now I'm no spy, and I'm not the kind of guy who enjoys sticking his neck out more than necessary, especially not after retirement. But there was something about the way she said it, like she'd already made up her mind that I was the best shot they had. I agreed, reluctantly. She walked me through how to capture better evidence, what to look for, how to document everything in a way that couldn't be dismissed or twisted in court. And most importantly, how to stay out of the line of fire while doing it. That night, I installed a second trail cam on the edge of my roof, aimed at Rick's driveway. I disguised it inside an old floodlight casing so it wouldn't draw attention. I also added a directional mic inside the birdhouse that had once only held a camera. My property was starting to look more like a sting operation than a suburban home, but I didn't care. I had a feeling things were about to blow wide open. It didn't take long. Within a week, the new cameras caught Rick flying one of those high-end commercial drones over a neighbor's backyard. He was wearing night vision goggles. Seriously, night vision goggles, and guiding the drone with a controller rig strapped to his chest like he was piloting an alien spacecraft. The footage was crystal clear. Even better, the directional mic picked up his voice talking into a Bluetooth earpiece, saying things like, "Zoom in more, I think that's her kid, and we'll keep this one in case they give us trouble." It wasn't just creepy. It was criminal. I handed everything to Paula the next morning. She didn't say much. Just, "This is more than we hoped for." 48 hours later, I was woken up by flashing blue and red lights outside my window. Rick's house was surrounded. Marked cruisers, unmarked sedans, even a black van with federal plates. They pulled him out in handcuffs while his latest girlfriend stood on the porch screaming that they had the wrong guy. But they didn't. Not this time. The search went on for hours. They pulled computers, hard drives, boxes of equipment. One agent carried out a duffel bag filled with what looked like compact cameras and listening devices. The truck was towed. The drone was confiscated. And just like that, the loudest mouth on the block was finally, completely silenced. What surprised me most wasn't that Rick had been hiding something big. It was how long he'd been getting away with it. People had complained for years, but the reports got lost, or ignored, or settled behind closed doors. It wasn't until someone stood up, documented everything, and connected the dots that the pieces finally fell into place. And I wasn't alone. The entire neighborhood started talking. Stories poured out. Turns out, Rick had a long list of victims. Neighbors, former girlfriends, even delivery drivers. People he'd bullied, harassed, intimidated into silence. But now, the silence had broken. The HOA scrambled to distance themselves, releasing a statement that said they had no knowledge of Mr. Whitman's extracurricular activities, and that they support the community in rebuilding a safe environment. That would have been fine, except I found out later that several members of the board had ignored previous complaints about Rick simply because he threatened to sue them if they brought anything to light. Cowards. By the end of the week, Rick was in federal custody, awaiting trial. The charges were long, complicated, and serious. I didn't celebrate. Not exactly. But I did stand on my porch that Saturday morning, sipping my coffee, watching a new wave of calm settle over the block. For the first time in months, I didn't feel tension in my chest. Just a strange, quiet sense of justice finally delivered. And as I looked at that steel-filled mailbox, standing tall at the edge of my yard, I realized it had never really been about mail. It was about what happens when the little guy decides enough is enough. About what happens when you stop letting bullies win. A week after Rick's arrest, the street felt like a completely different place. Quiet, calm, almost like the neighborhood was collectively exhaling after years of holding its breath. There was no more roar of Rick's truck barreling down the road, no thumping bass shaking windows during dinner, and no more sideways glares from someone who thought intimidation was a lifestyle. It was as if the color had returned to the houses. People walked their dogs a little slower, kids played outside again, and neighbors, some I hadn't seen in months, started waving when they passed by. Rick's house sat dark and silent, his truck gone, the windows shut like the place was trying to forget its own history. But nobody else was forgetting. Not anymore. The HOA tried to pretend like nothing had happened. A few board members resigned quietly, including the president who'd once tried to fine me into submission over a mailbox. At the next meeting, the turnout was triple what it had ever been. Folks showed up with clipboards, questions, and the kind of expressions that said they weren't buying any more bureaucratic deflections. By the end of the night, I'd been nominated and voted onto the board by an overwhelming majority, without even campaigning. Someone in the back yelled, "About time someone with a backbone ran this place," and the room erupted in applause. I didn't expect it, didn't even want it at first, but there was something poetic about taking the seat Rick used to manipulate for his own benefit. I accepted the position, shook hands with a dozen people, and walked out into the night with a strange new sense of peace. About a week later, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper, along with a photo. The note read, "Thank you. I know you didn't do it for anyone but yourself, but it helped more people than you know. He used to threaten me too. He thought he was untouchable. You proved him wrong." The photo was of Rick's truck, crumpled and gutted, sitting in a junkyard surrounded by rusted frames and shattered glass. Its front end was completely destroyed, the entire bumper torn off, and one of the headlights hung like a lazy eye. A red marker arrow was drawn on the picture, pointing to the hood with the words, "Mailbox 1, Truck 0. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. It was surreal how much had changed from something so simple. A mailbox, a block of steel and concrete wrapped in wood. That was all it took to start unraveling a monster's empire of fear and intimidation. But the best part wasn't Rick getting arrested, or the HOA losing their grip on the neighborhood. The best part was watching the way people came together afterward. The Sunday after the HOA shakeup, we held a neighborhood potluck on the green space between lots. Someone brought a grill, someone else brought folding tables, and by 5 o'clock the place was buzzing with laughter and chatter. There were burgers, hot dogs, cornbread, sweet tea, and more casseroles than any one event should ever legally allow. But what stood out wasn't the food, it was the atmosphere. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were a community again. During the potluck, a group of neighbors approached me with a strange request. They wanted to paint a small mural on the side of the mailbox. Nothing huge, just something symbolic. A little tribute. I thought they were joking, but then someone showed me the sketch. An eagle clutching an envelope in one claw and a busted tire in the other. Below it, in neat lettering, were the words, "Deliver with care. Or else." I couldn't say no. So the next week, we did it. A few of the teenagers in the neighborhood helped paint it. Someone even sealed it in weatherproof resin. Now, every time I check my mail, I'm greeted by that glorious symbol of stubborn resistance and perfect revenge. A few weeks after that, I got a call from someone representing the state's Public Safety Council. They'd heard about the story through local news coverage and online chatter. Apparently, the whole saga had gone semi-viral. A blog had picked it up, and from there it bounced through a few bigger sites. They wanted me to speak at a panel about neighborhood safety, creative problem solving, and citizen involvement. I didn't think I was qualified. I was just a guy who got tired of being pushed around. But they insisted. So I agreed, and a month later, I found myself standing behind a podium in a community center auditorium, talking to a room full of people who had no idea how close they were to building their own steel-filled monuments. After the event, a man came up to me and introduced himself as a contractor. Said he specialized in custom outdoor installations. Asked if I'd be interested in working with him to build a few fortress mailboxes for clients dealing with similar problems. At first, I thought he was joking. But he showed me his business card and even pulled out a tablet with photos of a few prototype designs. He'd already gotten inquiries. I told him I'd think about it, but the idea stuck in my head. Maybe this was something I could do in retirement. Help people feel secure. Give them something they could point to and say, "Go ahead, try it. See what happens." Months passed. Rick stayed locked up, the case growing longer and uglier by the day. More victims came forward. More evidence turned up. From what I heard, he was facing federal charges that came with real time, not community service, not probation. The system had finally caught up to him, and this time, it wasn't letting go. Meanwhile, I kept building. Not just mailboxes, fences, raised gardens, little backyard projects. My phone started ringing more often, neighbors asking for help with this or that. I never charged much. Sometimes I didn't charge at all. It wasn't about the money. It was about building something solid, something that lasts. The last time I visited the mailbox, really looked at it, I noticed a faint dent on the side. A reminder of the first time it was tested, when Rick tried to take it out with brute force and lost. I ran my hand over it and smiled. That dent wasn't damage. It was proof. Proof that something ordinary could become extraordinary. That sometimes doing the right thing doesn't start with speeches or lawsuit. Sometimes it starts with a log, some steel, and a man who's had enough. And that's the story. No hero's journey, no dramatic final battle in a courtroom. Just one neighbor, one mailbox, and the kind of justice that echoes across sidewalks and front yards for years to come.